The one with the tiny t-shirt is the 19th episode of the third season of Friends. This is directed by Terry Hughes, and as always, there will be spoilers as I talk about quite a lot, actually. There's a lot to unpack in this episode. And I guess the main thing to mention is that we are back in with the story, focusing on Ross and Rachel. But for the first time since their breakup, it's not as emotional. But there was one moment. There was one moment that definitely was unexpected. I mean, I've seen this episode many times before, but I think within the context of the episode, something happens that perhaps we wouldn't have foreseen, and it made it a little bit more raw and emotional. But I'll talk about that when I get there, because it is towards the end of the episode. Most of my thoughts are going to be chronological. And it starts off in Central Park with Gunther's internal monologue, thinking about asking Rachel out. Mark walks in. Gunther is in the back room and all we hear is chaos, and he walks out and says the most adorable thing. He just says, "I dropped a cup." It's one of those you had to be there things. Doesn't sound funny unless you're watching it, but it was just so cute. And I thought a really fun way to introduce the episode while also establishing that Mark is still very much in Rachel's life. And then we focus on Monica's relationship with Pete, and she reveals that she's not attracted to him, but she's still going out with him. And I like that. I like that she's being very honest, not necessarily to Pete, but to the others, that yes, he's rich, but that doesn't mean she's attracted to him. And I kind of like that. I like that she's saying, and that the show is establishing, that just because you have money, it doesn't mean everybody's going to be attracted to you. And I think that's a really good move to make. And while they're in the apartment, Joey just comes in and sings, dances around the room, and leaves again. And I thought it was rather fabulous. And then we find out that Joey got the part in the play, and he's acting alongside Kate, played by Dina Meyer. And I love this. It's something I think I've mentioned before. I love when we get to see Joey acting, because we don't get to see it that often. I'd say a couple of times per season, but I just love to see Joey doing what he loves. And that's largely because when he's not acting, he comes across as being, well, Joey. But when we see him acting, we can see that there is genuine talent and dedication there, sometimes more than others. But certainly in this case, he's really good at it. And there are sparks between him and Kate. And I think Kate is a really likable character. And then we find out that Ross is not happy that Rachel has packed up his stuff and is ready to take that next step in moving on. And of course, he demands his t-shirt back, and we have that iconic moment where Ross puts on the Frankie Says Relax t-shirt, and David Schwimmer looks brilliant, and Rachel can't hide her smirk, which I rather liked. There's also the moment a little later on where Rachel and Mark are coming out of the apartment just as Chandler and Ross are coming up the stairs. And Chandler is brilliant in this episode. I mean, he's always brilliant, but he really helps Ross to realise that it's okay to miss Rachel, but if she's ready to move on, maybe Ross should try and move on as well, because clinging on to her and wishing for something that Rachel is not suggesting will ever happen is not going to be healthy. And it's really nice to see Chandler being the voice of reason here, because often it's everybody else making Chandler feel better about his multiple failed relationships. And it's really lovely to see Chandler supporting Ross like that. And then we have a scene in the hospital where Pete is a guest, and Monica looks stunning. I love her outfit in this. She looks gorgeous. And we have a pretty important moment in their relationship where Pete asks what's going on, where are they, and Monica has to kind of reveal that things are maybe not in the right direction. And then we also have something very similar between Rachel and Mark, where Rachel has to admit that she's only with Mark to get back at Ross, and Mark's okay with that. And it's rather funny, because Mark says they can get back at Ross together, and then he's going to get back at Ross by himself. It's an amusing, it's a very amusing scene, but also I think really important in suggesting that actually Rachel and Mark aren't meant to be together. So it's not like Ross is going to have to see them together all of the time, which should, in theory, help Ross to get over Rachel if he's not being reminded of the person who did inadvertently break up Ross and Rachel. There was obviously more to it, but if Mark didn't exist and let's say Mark had been a woman, Ross and Rachel probably would have still been together. So I think the role of that character and how he drives the relationship, the breakup, and then getting over each other, I think is pretty interesting and pretty important. And of course, we have Joey clearly falling for Kate. That's all well and good, but then we realize that it looks like the director and Kate are dating. The director is played by Reg Rogers, and it's like a dagger through Joey's heart in that moment. But I still like Kate. It's not her fault. Definitely an interesting story to explore in more detail, but I won't say any more about that just now. And all of the main characters up until this point, apart from Phoebe, have had a pretty important role to play. And then we have at the ending, right before I get in with the emotional bit, the very last scene is Chandler and Phoebe discussing Goldman, which I thought was really delightful, a really fun way to end the episode. We also don't often get Chandler and Phoebe on their own together, although there is one particular storyline in the future that is very much just Chandler and Phoebe. It's not what you think, but look out for that if you haven't seen it. But in this episode, it's nice to have that one scene between them and nice to have some focus on Phoebe as she's had a bit of a backseat up until this point. But just before we get to that final scene, we do have the very emotional scene where Ross has given his stuff back to Rachel and she opens the box and it's the t-shirt. And there's that brief moment where I think there are two things to acknowledge. The first is that Ross is over his pettiness and he's able to give Rachel this t-shirt back because he genuinely still cares for her and he genuinely wants to make her happy. But I also think there was that moment where Rachel saw it and all of the positive memories about her relationship with Ross came flooding back to her. That's my reading of that moment. So it was definitely very emotional and could definitely put a little lump in the throat. Certainly a very brief but very moving and I think quite telling moment. The one with the tiny t-shirt is a brilliant episode, very funny, a lot of different things going on here, a lot of interesting relationship things happening as well, and I think always definitely going to be an episode that I really thoroughly enjoyed. I don't think it's ever going to be an all-time favourite, but I think in terms of moving narratives forward and also having some very specific key funny moments, it's definitely high up there as a contender for a favourite from this season.